Hi there, back with Cataclysm here at Diagonal Move. We're halfway through the action phase of the 1933-34 turn. We need to keep drawing counters from the cup until we draw that fourth crisis marker. Then we assess whether or not we have a turn end based on the number of counters per side, which is itself based on the level of commitment the relevant factions are at. So we'll assess that when the time comes, but there's a little way to go depending on those chit draws for those crisis markers. There is at least 2 to draw before we will need to check for that sudden death element. And we had, at the end of the last turn, we had a situation where the Chinese Civil War ended. And I'll be honest, not entirely sure, not completely convinced that I actually did that Civil War resolution correctly. I find the Chinese Civil War rules to be a little bit tricky to follow, just personally, but I'll go with the result because it is actually an interesting result and would likely happen anyway in many of the games that I recall playing over the years. But basically what happened was the Civil War ended because there was only one side left, or one faction left in that Civil War. The playable factions support either the Chinese Communists or the other side in that Civil War, and we had a resolution. The Chinese Communists managed to eradicate all the right-wing side, and so the Civil War ended with a victory for the Chinese Communists. Now that's really good for Russia because the Soviet Union were supporting through the use of aid as represented by this counter here, the Chinese Communists. And so what that means then is that when there is an attempt to gain territory through non-military means, if there is a Chinese Communist army, which is these counters here, in the province that is going to be attempting to, the Soviets will be attempting to control, there'll be an additional modifier to the good for that region. There are a couple of regions to try to take over as the Soviets before that would happen, but what will happen is the next time the Civil War is resolved, which will be in the next turn at the earliest, the Chinese Communists will start to try to expand their territory in China. Of course, for the fascists, this is not such a good thing. So for Japan, who really are limited in what they can do, they have very few resources of their own, only one in their own home territories. There's an additional natural resource in Manchuria for as long as they can control Manchuria, which is this bit here. But the third resource that they got in the beginning of this first turn is actually an American resource, which will disappear at some point as the sides start to become belligerent with each other and start to sort of edge towards conflict. So the resources that the Japanese are really along this Chinese coast, and the Japanese will need to go and get them, which is going to be slightly tricky because you've got the Chinese Communist armies in there, and also, I don't know if you can see, but there's a fist on some of these areas, which means there is natural resistance to any type of occupation, and also some of the areas have this speckly terrain, which means there is also an issue with the terrain, an adverse terrain, which again is a DRM at certain points in the game for when you're trying to take over those regions. So from a Soviet point of view, we need to leverage that end of the Chinese Civil War as much as we can. From a Japanese point of view, we really need to try to limit what's going on with that Chinese Communist army in China. Okay, impact on the other side of the map though is a bit less at the moment because there's no other civil wars. The civil war has ended in China, which basically means they can't send any military aid to anybody until another civil war erupts, and they will come through the crisis markers. The most likely place is probably Spain, but we can't send aid there until that civil war happens. So that's where we are at the moment in terms of the impact of that final piece of action at the end of the last video. From the point of view of what's happening now, I think the Germans and the Italians really need to start thinking about moving to rearmament status in terms of their commitment, because that will give them more forces, particularly for the Italians, who have very few forces at the moment, and it will also allow them to really build up towards a declaration of war and really start grabbing territory because you can't declare war until you hit mobilization, which is another 2 steps up the commitment track. The commitment track being these things here. Okay, so with all that said, all that background done, let's just jump into the first chip and see where we go. Okay, first up we have a Soviet army. The armies always start on their what's the phrase? The soldier side rather than the tank side. The tank side is an upgrade that you have to pay for essentially through your resources at the start of a turn. Okay, so we will place the soldier. We need to go to an industrial resource, which is here, and then mobilize, just deploy to somewhere. Now we have this issue for the Soviets where this territory between the Urals and Siberia is so vast that we have to place a transcontinental railway there, which is like a logistical thing, representing how difficult it is to go from one side of the map to the other. And that's true wherever there's sort of an arrow, there's basically a delay, and you go and sit in a delay box, and then you move a bit later on in the game. Except for the Soviets, you can put in this counter for the transcontinental railway or the Trans-Siberian Railway, which doesn't mean you have that same issue. But right now, what it means is we cannot place forces on this side of the map. And those armies and the Air Force in the Pacific Theatre map are actually out of supply as well. So really, that's something we do need to think about doing quite soon, is actually getting that Trans-Siberian Railway up if we can. But what we're going to do is we're going to move our forces into Moscow, and then we're going to deploy them to, I think we're probably going to deploy them to the edge of Poland. I do have to check whether that is going to be a provocation for the French because they're adjacent to that part of Russia. No, there's no need to give the French a provocation for moving forces to the edge of the territory there in Byelorussia, if that's how you pronounce it. So those little R's are really important for the Soviets because they represent restricted terrain, areas that are just vast, or there's some other natural feature that prevents certain things from happening as easily as other areas. So for example, in the Libyan and French North African deserts, in the jungles of Burma and Indochina, and the vastness of the Soviet Union. And what it will do is it will block line of communication and reduce occupation limits. Doesn't affect movement, but you do need to place what's called a logistics unit, which we don't have any on the board at the moment, but they're basically little barrels which negate the effects of that restricted terrain. So in order to have a good line of communication through the desert, you'd have to have a logistics unit in there, for example. But what's really important about the Soviets and why it's such an advantage for them is that on their home territory, they ignore that. And that makes invading Russia really quite difficult for the powers that may wish to do that. It's just a general rule across the whole of the Soviet territory called General Winter. Okay, let's move on to the next thing. Oh, we need to check with regard to the interrupts, don't we? And I should have done that at the start of the game, actually, but let's have a look at the interrupts. And I think we're going to use the interrupt for the fascists. Japan really should do something. I'm not sure what. I think what we'll try to do, demonstration of diplomacy. We'll try and get some diplomacy here in Chahar. Now, diplomacy, what you do is you roll dice equal to effectiveness, and a 5 or a 6, you do occupy that area, and you control that area as a power. Okay, so we roll the 2 dice, and we're looking for 5s and 6s. We would adjust for any fists that are printed on the map. So for example, Mongolia has a fist, that would be a negative DRM. And also if there are any other cubes in there, any control or anything like that, we would adjust the roll. But in this case, we don't adjust at all. We're just looking for 5s or 6s. But doing this will be a provocation to the Soviet Union because they're adjacent in Mongolia. And we failed, which is pretty pitiful quite frankly. And being diplomacy, we don't actually get to place a cube over here, which would provide a DRM for the next time we attempt that action. So that has not worked for the Japanese. The Soviets, let's just do the exact same thing. We want to get in there as the Soviets. We will interrupt and we'll do the same thing. And we will roll 2 dice for the Soviets. However, due to our military reform posture, I believe it's a -1 on the DRM to all political actions. So we may need to think about changing our military reforms to another status, possibly collective security, which may allow us to negate that penalty. Okay, that is a political action, though, I believe, in order for us to do that. Yeah, it's a political action. Therefore, we would have a 5 or a 6, I think, to do that political action. I'm just going to go and try and take over Johar. That's a pitiful roll. So that was not great for the Soviets either. Now, what we need to do is think about what the Americans and indeed the fascists and or the French are going to do. The Americans are a little bit stuck in terms of what they can do right now. They don't have any flags available. They've only got a military offensive. Now, the military actions they can do with that offensive, what can they do? Good question. They could. I don't know what they're going to do. They are going to use that offensive to send a flag. No, they can't, because it's an offensive, not a flag of its own. Okay. Let's wait. Let's just wait and see. But the fascists can go, and the fascists will, as the Italians will, use Il Duce to roll for an increase in commitment. Now, Il Duce, if I recall correctly, and I am just having to have a quick look at the faction cards, yeah, we roll an additional die if we spend that particular counter. So that's going to be a 5 or a 6 for the Italians to increase their commitment from civilian to rearmament, and that's successful. Okay, so Il Duce comes off, but we've increased the commitment. Okay, now that is a provocation, I believe, to the other side. Let me just double check that. Yep, that's a provocation to both the British and the French. Okay, so the British and the French will both gain a flag. The British will place theirs on the reserve track. And the French, unfortunately, don't have one, so they're not going to get anything right now. Their flags are on the board and in the cup, clearly. Okay, so what will happen, because the Italians have moved to rearmament, they will now have a conversion rate of 1-to-1, and the available forces they've got will increase to 2. So we just need to have a think about what we're going to place in that available force pool, which is an excellent question. So the available counters are land armies, air forces, and fleets, also submarines and logistics counters and army upgrades. I think for now, though, with the overall lack of units the Italians have, we'll use our extra forces to be an air force and a land army. Now, they both go into the available force pool, and we can build those either as a military action or when we decide, or when the time comes in the next turn during production. So the reason I've chosen those over something else is because the Italians really need to try to control the the Mediterranean Sea, that is, and they can do that in a few ways. They can have fleets and submarines in order to block lines of supply, particularly to places like Malta, Cyprus, Gibraltar, and so on. There's 2 British fleets in there. So they really want to try to control lines of supply through the Med using the Navy, but they also need to be prepared for any kind of attack from the French or even the British, to, into that sort of underbelly of Europe, as you like. So, yeah, for now, I think I will use those extra forces to be land and air armies, because there's always the possibility trying to grab some resources in Provence. Now, we could also go to Yugoslavia and so on and so forth, but really the Italians are not the most powerful faction in the game, so they've got to really be quite clever in how they do things, and also ally pretty quickly with Germany to try and provide that stability, and then share locations and so on for their forces. So that's the Italians. Now the British and French can now do something from the reserve track. I think we'll try to form an alliance, actually, because that's looking pretty tricky. But there is the status quo marker in place. No, that's fine, no effect there. So we'll try to form an alliance. The British will play the counter. However, the French also need an alliance, a flag to play, and we'll use the lower of the two effectivenesses to decide the roll, and again 5 or 6 wins. So basically it's a single die, 5 or 6. The British and French will become allies, which gives them certain benefits in terms of sharing territories and so on, will allow the British to use French territory for their armies and stuff. Unfortunately, on one dice that's quite unlikely, but this time a cube will go into the alliance box should we fail. And we failed, so we need to find a cube for the French, I believe it is, because they were the ones that had to roll. Next time the British and French try to ally, or even the French and the Americans, they will have a negative DRM because of that previous failed attempt. In terms of provocation, I believe it's only a provocation if they are successful in forming the alliance, rather than when they try. So basically they're having a few political wrangles about how they can get into an alliance together. So the US cannot interrupt, so back to our next regular chip bomb. We have the American home front, nothing to do there because they are at the civilian phase, or the civilian commitment level. No further interrupts possible right now. We have a German offensive marker. Oh, that's interesting. What do we do with a German offensive marker? Right, okay, that's interesting. We have to use it or lose it, basically, although we could put it on the reserve track. The Germans do have the ability to spend that on a build. I don't believe we need a resource if we use it now. Yep, we can construct any eligible unit that we have in our force pool with that offensive. That's useful, and we're going to do that to pop a land army in Berlin, I think. Actually, wait a minute, I think it may have to go into the cup. One sec. Yep, it needs to go into the cup. It could have gone in reserve, but we'll put it in the cup. I'm really hoping the Germans have a flag somewhere. And we have a crisis marker. That's the second one, and we'll roll on the peacetime crisis table. That's a 4-3. And somewhere over here is the crisis table. So a 4-3 is a political crisis. Parliamentary paralysis that will reduce the UK's effectiveness by 1 until the end of the turn. Oh, that's not good. Maybe that's why the British didn't ally. Okay, negative effectiveness for the British. Still no way to interrupt. And we have a Japanese offensive. Now the Japanese could build, because that is an option, just like it was for the the Germans, but there's only fleets, and fleets are a little restricted right now due to the naval treaty. So what we could do is we could just occupy it, basically invade. Don't need to declare war unless we're attacking the Soviets, which we won't do. Not right now. And this, I think it's a regular land operation. Yeah, it's a regular land operation. And there's a little process to go through for that. So the land operation is going to be from Manchuria into Chahar. Although actually, let's not do that. Let's do a land operation into Hebei, because there's a resource there we can grab. And so the first thing we do is we will work out the type operation. It's a land operation. We've activated the land army, which will go into Hebei. We can't augment, which is another military action. A second military action you would spend to give yourself a die roll modifier, I believe it is, or possibly a new dice. I can't remember right now. Then you would provoke any powers that provoked would gain a flag. No one's provoked right now. We do have line of supply. That's fine. We resolve combat. The support will come from the aeroplanes. We automatically have air superiority because the Chinese don't have any aircraft. And then we just resolve the combat. And what we'll do is we'll roll 2 dice by default for both sides. The red dice in this case will represent the Chinese. Then we will adjust based on air superiority and so on. So we do have air superiority. No one has any tanks, so that's not applicable. There's no air carrier superiority, no aid. We're not in limited supply. We do have one of those resistance fists under there, though. But I don't believe that is an issue right now. Therefore, it's 3 dice against 2, and we will see what we get. Okay, we have 8 for the Chinese and 6 for the Japanese. Okay, that's terrible. Okay, the highest score wins combat. Yeah, so that's, well, really it's 6 against 3. There's a dice system where you take the highest number. 6 against 3. And then we divide one by the other in order to determine the number of losses. The Japanese have lost that unit because there's a 2-to-1, so they go back into the available force pool, and the aftermath then would be basically a retreat, and I'll follow the process for the aftermath, bear with me. The air units regroup, so they basically go back. That's not cool, just to say, for the Japanese, because they now have no garrison in Manchuria, meaning that's quite vulnerable. We were not adjacent to any Soviets, so there's no flags. It is a disaster because we lost so badly. Which I think means we need to conduct a stability test. Yep, it looks like we're conducting a stability test for the Japanese. But we're okay, we rolled a 6. Okay, the defeat in China was so bad, the government were brought into question. Wow, that's pretty shoddy, frankly. Interesting thought for the other powers, because the Japanese are now beginning to get a little bit aggressive. Okay, next chit. We have Soviet political action. Okay, now I do want to try to get that Trans-Siberian Railway up and running. It's still a -1 because it's a political action. I'm just going to double check that there's any special rule for that. No, it's fine. Okay, so it's just 2 dice and a 5 or a 6, -1. No, we haven't done it because we've got that political issue with the military reforms action. That's frustrating in the extreme. Okay, next chit. We have another offensive for the US. They'll just spend it on a build, and they'll build themselves a fleet. Our fleet's cost 2, so it is an air force, and the air force will just go over here into the east coast. The Germans have their next army, which we'll place in Berlin. Oh, the Ruhr is actually demilitarized. I don't recall putting that the other way. So we put it in Berlin for now, and then we'll need to think about how we get the Ruhr out of its demilitarized state. Oh, we just need to move a German army in there. Okay, that's fine. We can do that. In fact, we can place that land unit and then move it through its initial deployment. So that's now the Ruhr is remilitarized. And I'm pretty sure that's going to be a provocation. Yeah, that's a provocation for France. France do now finally have a flag that they can actually take. And so that will go into the French reserve, I think, in this case. Next up, we have another French flag. We will need to do a political action now. I think I want to try to get a flag to the British, so that we can, one of us can attempt the alliance. So I will play that now in an attempt to put propaganda, is it? It's either propaganda or pressure, I can't remember which one. It's one of those two, which will basically, it lets you swap your flag for somebody else's. Yeah, it's called pressure. So a 5 or a 6 then for the French. And it's a 5, so the British will gain a flag, which they will place into reserve so that we can use that for an attempt to form an alliance. Can't interrupt there because that was a democracy turn. So now we have the British army, which will go into London. Need to start thinking as well about how we get some of the perhaps the Benelux countries or Denmark or Norway onto the side of the democracies through some kind of political means. But at the moment, that's quite tricky. Japanese flag. Okay, a Japanese flag. We can use that flag. Can we use that flag to remove the naval treaty? Oh no, we can do that regardless, but that's a provocation. Okay. So we don't want to give them too much political power right now, those two countries. So let's see what we can do in terms of political actions. We can't declare war because we're only at rearmament. We can try diplomacy again. Yeah, let's try that. Manoeuvres would let us do a military action. And rebuild, yeah. We'll do a manoeuvres. So now with manoeuvres, we can do the military action, which would be a build in this case to get that army back into the field. But we have to roll the dice to pass the political action test, if you like. We have, which means that flag can be changed for the army, and that will go into the cup. What do the Americans want to do? There's the option to move. Well, we can't really do anything with the fleets in the minute until the naval treaty's gone for the Americans, because the Americans have got fleets in Pearl Harbor, including a carrier fleet, and they've also got fleets on the west coast They really don't have anything there in the Philippines, and all these little bases we could take advantage of to move, but we just can't do it while the Washington Naval Treaty's there, and the Japanese are the only ones that can remove that, unless we move to a war footing, which we're not at the moment, and that's going to be a while yet for those democracies. We can't easily just declare war as those democracies, not until somebody else is belligerent. Anyway, next chit, a crisis marker. This is crisis number 3. In this case, we just roll the 2 dice, and this time we have 6-2. Still at peace, which means we have a little entente. So that means powers with a cube in ungarrisoned Czechoslovakia, Romania, or Yugoslavia perform an effectiveness check for each. And then if the check fails, remove the cube. Oh, wow. So the French have, wow, they have 3 checks ahead of them because they've got Yugoslavia, Romania, and Czechoslovakia as occupied or ungarrisoned controlled areas. So it's a effectiveness check for each, so basically a 5+ on all of these next 3 rolls. So starting with Czechoslovakia, that's a pass, that's good. Starting with Romania, that's not cool. They failed, so we remove the cube. Okay, I'll sort what the implications of that out in a minute. And then Yugoslavia, we'll do again. That's also a fail. So the French have got some crises with their more minor allies, shall we say, or the controlled regions. Removing those 2 cubes means we also immediately remove 2 French VPs. So that's less than ideal from a French point of view, because now it does free up that area a little bit for the Italians and the Germans in terms of diplomacy and so on. However, the French do still hold Czechoslovakia. Next chit, 1 more crisis marker, and we'll have to do a sudden death check. Okay, we've got the crisis marker. So now we check for the sudden death. We have 2 powers at rearmament, so that's the most applicable one that we will need to check. I'll just find where it says that on here. Okay, so we need 2 or more counters for any power to continue, because according to the sudden death check, you have civilian and rearmament are effectively the same threshold. So 2 or more. So what have we got in there? Well, you can see there's a couple of Japanese ones. So we'll continue. That crisis marker, though, will go back into the cup, and the turn marker will flip to sudden death. British home front test, no need right now. Just thinking how we might be worth us trying to send something over to Australia. That's the British, or at least Egypt. We would need to do a deployment action for that, and you do get a free deployment action as part of your home front test. Yeah, I will use that free deployment action that comes with the home front test to move an army. And I think what I'll do, because I want to move it over to the Pacific Theatre, because there's a lot of territory there for the British that could come under threat from the Japanese. Maybe not yet, but eventually. However, there is this threat here from the Italians brewing as well in the Mediterranean. So let's move a land army. With movement, there's 3 different types, and we get to do this deployment action free as part of the home front. There's different types of movement. So we use land movement, air movement, and sea movement, depending on the unit type. However, you just sort of assume units are in boats when they're land armies, and they can use different types of movements across different terrain, but following the restrictions of certain movement types. So, for example, we're not allied with anyone right now, so we have to go around the French areas. So we can use 2 movement to go to the base, and then 2 movement, I think it is, to go from here, 1, 2 to Malta, and then 1, 2 to go to Egypt. So they've got a unit there in Egypt, which hopefully you can see on the bottom of the screen. Okay, a couple more counters than we've drawn that crisis counter again, but we still have 2 Japanese in there, so we have to keep going. That goes back in the cup. A German flag. Now that I'm going to use straight away to try to move to mobilization or rearmament, sorry, get those confused. That's 3 dice for the Germans, and 5s or 6s will move us to rearmament. And roll a 6, the Germans will go to rearmament. They get an additional 4 forces that they can build, but it is a provocation to loads of people, which will now basically give everyone flags. So the French get a flag, the British get a flag, and the Soviet Union get a flag. The French and British will have to go into the cup, and the Soviets can choose to place it in reserve or put it on the cup. I think right now I'll put it on the reserve. Yeah, let's put it on the reserve. Because we don't get an action next turn, an automatic flag next turn, so we could probably keep that and it will go into our holding box for use next turn. Let's do that, okay. But we do have some more flags into the cup. And we have a British Air Force, which will just go into London. Soviets could react to that with an interrupt, but they won't. Another military action for the Americans, which we'll spend as a build, and we'll build the fleet, and we'll just put the fleet probably in the Pacific, getting ourselves ready. Although we can't actually build fleets per se, but we can build submarine packs, which don't count as fleets. It's confusing. Anyway, keep going. No need for the Soviets to interrupt there. Fascists can't interrupt. British flag, which we will use to... Let's try and perform diplomacy. We'll do it against Norway, I think. Yeah, let's have some diplomacy going on in Norway. They have a reduced effectiveness, so it's just a 1 die, but it's a 5 or 6. No, that was no good. Okay, but at least we tried, eh? Crisis marker again. We still have those Japanese counters in there. So redraw. No interrupts needed from the Soviets right now. Okay, Japanese land army, which will go there and then deploy over to Manchuria. Okay, so if we draw that crisis marker, that will be the end of the turn. Yeah, crisis marker's drawn. That is the end of the turn. A few different things to do when you go to the end of the turn. You basically add in all the counters, take all the counters that need to go back into the cup to one side. The stuff on the reserve track you put in the forces holding boxes, and then you play any game events from the cup. Now we don't have any game events. This is things like the home front tests. We've just got those, so those go back to the relevant sides as well. And I've just realised I have not actually given the Germans their 4 extra units, which I will shortly, and I will give them those now, actually, before I forget again. So we'll have 2 land armies, an upgrade marker. Oh, do you know what? Let's go for 3 land armies and the upgrade marker. Okay. that is the end of the turn. I will tidy things up ready for the next turn and the next video. I hope this is giving you a sense of how the game works and everything interconnects and the dynamics of the game. Okay, any comments, etc.? Let me know in the comments field. Obviously I've broken this particular turn down into now 4 separate videos rather than one longer one, which would be what I would normally do. If you do prefer the longer videos versus this sort of more installment based approach, do let me know. We'll see how it goes for the rest of the game. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you for 1935.